Are you tired of mediocre online presences? Want to showcase your work in a way that truly represents your brand and creativity? Then look no further than Squarespace, our sponsor for today's video. As the all-in-one platform for building a website, Squarespace has everything you need to make your online presence shine. Stick around for more about them in a bit. To the world at large, Captain Kidd is regarded as one of the most dreaded pirates in history, often mentioned alongside the likes of Blackbeard and Henry Everett. To those who learn his story, though, William Kidd becomes a much more complex and controversial figure, even a tragic one. It seems that although he chased glory, fame, and fortune, he wanted to do it as a legitimate captain and not as a criminal. He tried to resist crossing that line as long as he could, but in the face of adversity, great misfortune, and a mutinous crew, Captain Kidd seemingly turned to the dark side. William Kidd was born circa 1654 in Dundee, Scotland, to John Kidd and Bessie Burchard. We should mention that other places, such as Greenock, have tried to lay claim to being the true birthplace of the infamous Captain Kidd. However, during his trial, Kidd's own written testimony said that he was originally from Dundee in the Kingdom of Scotland, so we presume that he knew his own place of birth. Plus, the city also has a record of a sailor's pension that his mother received after his father died when he was 5 years old. As is the case with most of the other pirates that we've covered here, the early life of William Kidd is pretty obscure. Since he came from a poor family raised by a widow on a sailor's pension, he didn't exactly hold the keys to the city. Options were limited, and he needed to find work from an early age. So, after a few years of basic schooling, it is likely that William Kidd took to the seas just like his father. Consequently, we now enter a black hole when it comes to his life story, and we emerge from it decades later during the mid-1680s when Kidd was already an experienced seaman in his early 30s. At that point, Kidd made his way to a tiny speck of land off the coast of Hispaniola in the Caribbean named Isle Vache. There he met his future companion and arch nemesis, Robert Culliford, a sailor from Cornwall, and the duo struck up a friendship as they were both looking for work on a vessel. They found it upon the Saint Rose, a French privateer captained by Jean Fantin, that came into port to recruit crew. It wasn't an ideal position. As is tradition aboard French ships, the crew was predominantly, French, while Kidd was the only Scottish sailor alongside a dozen or so Englishmen. But beggars can't be choosers, and work was pretty scarce at the time since all the maritime nations were at peace with each other. Piracy was always an option, but you know what they say, once you raise the black, you can't go back, and Kidd seemed particularly inclined for life as an outlaw. Privateering, of course, was basically legalized piracy, where a ship received a letter of marque from a governor that entitled it to attack and plunder vessels in coastal towns that were deemed enemies of the state. The downside was that you could only attack approved targets, and you had to kick back a share of the spoils to the government, but on the other hand, you didn't have a noose waiting for you when you got back home, so that's a plus. Even though things were quiet at the time, there were rumblings of war breaking out between France and the Netherlands, so ultimately Kidd decided that he probably did not have to wait until there was some action to be had, so he signed up with the Saint Rose and went out looking for Dutch merchants. During his voyages, the Saint Rose ran into a French fleet led by Admiral Jean-Baptiste de Casse. Like them, the fleet was looking to cause some trouble for the Dutch, so Kidd's ship joined them as they sailed to Suriname on the northern coast of South America, which was called Dutch Guiana at the time. On the way there, though, they stumbled upon a big juicy target, a cargo-laden vessel coming from Havana. Just one problem, though, it was Spanish, not Dutch. Even at the best of times, the line between piracy and privateering can get a little hazy. Sailors tend to get pretty rowdy when they are left bereft of booty for far too long. The French really didn't want to lose this prize, so they found a loophole. Since the Saint Rose technically didn't hold a valid commission, only they would make the capture. The other ships would simply observe with their cannons pointed at the Spanish vessel. Then, if somehow the plunder would get divided equally and end up in the cargo holds of the whole French fleet, it would indeed, by a fortuitous series of unexpected events. No sense in arguing about it at this point since the deed was already done. And wouldn't you know it, that was exactly what happened, except that the crew of the Saint Rose abandoned their former vessel and upgraded to the faster, better armoured Spanish ship. Afterward, they continued on to Dutch Guiana to do what they actually sailed there to do, and attack the port town, only to discover 7 armed Dutch warships sitting in the harbour, eagerly awaiting a little dust-up. The French fleet got walloped pretty badly by cannon fire and sailed away with its mast tucked between its legs. The fleet was trying to decide its next move when the stunning news reached it in July 1688, England had declared war on France. In fact, pretty much every European maritime power had done so, triggering the 9 Years' War, or the War of the Grand Alliance. This created a bit of an awkward situation for William Kidd and the other British crewmen, who now found themselves sailing with the enemy, but the French seemed cool about it. They assumed that everyone aboard valued plunder above patriotism, and that this new war simply gave them more targets to attack. This, however, was a miscalculation on the part of the French, as their British crewmen were more loyal to king and country than expected. Once the war had started, de Casse's fleet attacked the island of St. Christopher's, now called St. Kitts, back then jointly owned by the French and the English. They launched a full-scale land assault, leaving behind only a handful of men to watch the ships. On the vessel commanded by Jean Vintin, this included William Kidd and all the English sailors, since they generally stuck together. Once all the land troops were out of sight and the tide was out, Kidd gave the signal to strike. The English crewmen unsheathed their daggers and attacked the remaining Frenchmen, who were taken completely by surprise. Throats were cut and backs were stabbed as the British threw their former comrades in the water and prepared the ship to cast off. Kidd and his men had just stolen a ship from the French fleet and headed for the neighbouring British Isle, Nevis. There they received a hero's welcome and were invited to drink with the governor, where William was introduced for the first time in his life as Captain Kidd. Are you a creator looking to build a website that truly represents your unique brand and style? Well, look no further than today's sponsor, Squarespace. With over 40 design options and easy drag and drop features, creating a professional and unique website has never been easier. Plus, Squarespace's mobile-ready and responsive design ensures that your website will look perfect on any device. But that's not all. Monetize your content in a way that reflects your brand identity with member areas from Squarespace. And with built-in SEO tools like meta descriptions and keywords, your website will be easily indexed by search engines and quickly found by your target audience. Squarespace also offers automatic backups, top-quality hosting, and 24/7 customer service. And with an extensive library of how-tos, you'll always have the guidance and support you need. Don't take our word for it. You can try Squarespace for yourself with their free trial. And when you're ready to launch, just go to squarespace.com/biographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Trust us, your audience will thank you. And now back to today's video. It was now official. The ship that Kidd had stolen was renamed the Blessed William, and he was appointed the new captain. The Blessed William joined a small fleet commanded by the local governor, Colonel Christopher Codrington. By Christmas, the fleet was joined by another privateer, Captain Hewetson, who, together with Kidd, led an assault on the French island of Marie Galante as a revenge for the attack on St. Christopher. The following year, Kidd locked horns with his former running mates, led by de Casse, and mounted a successful rescue of some English troops who had been taken prisoner. Hewetson was very complimentary of Kidd's skills in naval warfare, later writing that Kidd was with me in 2 engagements against the French and fought as well as any man I ever saw. Back in the English Isles, Captain Kidd was hailed a hero and feasted at banquets. It seemed like he was the man of the hour, but there was one group of people who weren't particularly thrilled with him at that moment: his own men. Fighting for their country was fine and dandy, but only as long as it was rewarded with shiny coins and precious gems. Risking their lives for the English Navy was not something they signed up for. They made it clear to Kidd they wanted to go pirating. French, Spanish, Dutch, Romulan. It didn't really matter as long as there was booty to be had. Kidd refused, so Culliford persuaded the men to mutiny, sailing away on the Blessed William during the night. All of a sudden, Kidd found himself not only bereft of his ship and crew, but also of his share of the plunder when they sacked Marie Galante. He was penniless and shipless, but his reputation was still in good standing in the Caribbean, so Governor Codrington hired him to command one of his privateers in the war with France. After a year of loyal service, Kidd was rewarded with his own ship, a modest 16-gun sloop they captured from the French, which was renamed the Antigua. Now that he was Captain Kidd again, he could travel at his leisure once more. His hatred for Culliford and the rest of the mutineers still burned in his heart, so when he received word the Blessed William had been spotted in New York City, he weighed anchor and set sail for revenge. Upon arrival in New York, Kidd discovered that he had missed his former ship by a few months, but once again found himself embroiled in someone else's conflict. Kidd had arrived just in time to take part in the conclusion of a bizarre episode from New York's early history, known as Leisler's Rebellion. Back in 1689, wealthy Protestant merchant and militia captain Jacob Leisler took over part of the colony by force when he heard that English King James II, who was a Catholic, had been deposed by William of Orange, himself a fellow Protestant. Leisler named himself acting governor, fully expecting to receive the backing of the new king. William, however, wasn't impressed with his efforts despite his Protestant pedigree and instead declared him to be a usurper and ordered to have Leisler arrested and executed. As it happened, Captain Kidd arrived in New York the same time as the new governor, Henry Sloughter, and his support troops commanded by Colonel Ingoldsby. As one might expect, Leisler wasn't in a hurry for a date with the gallows, so he barricaded himself inside the fort. Since Kidd happened to be in the neighborhood and had cannons to spare, the real governor asked him if he wouldn't mind terribly lending a hand. Kidd accepted, although ultimately it proved unnecessary. Leisler eventually surrendered peacefully, presumably at the insistence of his own wary garrison, who had no interest in fighting their own countrymen just to keep him in power. Leisler was arrested and executed for treason. Sloughter became the new governor of New York, and Captain Kidd was once again hailed as a hero for saving the colony from tyranny. New York's wealthy merchants were particularly grateful, and Captain Kidd found himself as the guest of honor at many banquets, shindigs, hootenannies, and box socials. At one such function, Kidd made the acquaintance of Sarah Bradley Cox-Ort, one of the most beautiful, desirable, and wealthiest widows in town. The captain put his Scottish charms to work, and after just a few months of wooing, the former widow became Sarah Bradley Cox-Ort Kidd. The marriage also turned William Kidd into one of the richest and most respected men in New York, so for the next few years he was content with living the life of a colonial patrician. He bought some land, had a couple of daughters, and served as a respectable pillar of the community. He still kept the Antigua ready for action. Since England and France were still at war, Kidd had a privateering commission from the New York governor to attack French ships that got too close to their shores, and he later received a similar commission from Massachusetts. But this life proved too quaint and too quiet for a man of action like William Kidd, and ultimately he decided that it was time for a career change. In 1695, Kidd sailed to London hoping to secure a captain's post with the Royal Navy. This was phenomenally ambitious, even foolhardy. The Navy had a pretty strict promotion system. Maybe if you were the son of a lord, you could skip a few steps, but Kidd was the son of a dead Scottish sailor, and as far as we know, had never served aboard a Royal Navy vessel, and now he was hoping to be made captain of his own ship right off the bat. This was never going to happen. In fact, Kidd couldn't even secure a meeting where he could be told no to his face, but destiny soon provided him with another opportunity. While in London, he ran into some merchant acquaintances from New York, and they knew a friend who knew some friends, and together they hatched a plan to obtain a privateering commission and a new ship for Kidd to go hunting for pirates and Frenchmen. A man named Robert Livingstone, we presume, orchestrated the whole thing and got some very influential noblemen to pony up the dough to build Kidd one of the most powerful ships prowling the seven seas, a 3-mast, 32-cannon, 287-ton warship called the Adventure Galley. Captain Kidd even signed a performance bond for £20,000, guaranteeing that sum to his backers. If he failed to deliver, Kidd was liable for the money himself, which meant that he could not only lose his fortune, but even end up in debtor's prison. Clearly, he was not lacking in confidence, but in the immortal words of Han Solo, great Kidd, don't get cocky. In April 1696, the Adventure was ready to sail. But not so fast, said Captain Stewart of the HMS Duchess. While navigating its way through the waters of the mouth of the Thames, the Adventure failed to follow proper Royal Navy etiquette of dipping the flag or pulling the canvas out of respect when passing a superior, and Stewart was the kind of man who took umbrage to such behaviour. When he wasn't shown the proper deference, he ordered the Duchess to fire a shot across the bow of the Adventure Galley. Then he came aboard the ship and informed the captain that he would be press-ganging his 30 most experienced sailors into service. This was something that Stewart could do as a Royal Navy captain. Kidd appealed to the Lord Admiral, who eventually ordered Stewart to return the men to the Adventure, but the Navy captain still had the last laugh. Although he returned the same number of men, it wasn't the ones he originally press-ganged, instead using the opportunity to unload his 30 laziest and most troublesome scurvy sea dogs on Captain Kidd. Not an auspicious start for Kidd's career as a pirate hunter, and things were about to get worse. He had made quite lofty promises, and needed to plunder a lot of ships in order to hold up his end of the bargain. It made sense for the Adventure to sail where the pirates were, so it set course for Madagascar, which was supposed to be one of the trendiest pirate havens of the day. Except that by the time Kidd got there, the party was over and everyone had left. There simply weren't any targets to be had. On top of this, many men were starting to show signs of scurvy, while the Adventure itself wasn't faring particularly well since it had been built hastily and on a budget. Kidd had no choice but to dock while his men rested and his vessel was patched up. He then sailed to the nearby Comoro Islands, which served as a stop-off point for ships from the East India Trading Company. Kidd hoped to find a peaceful island where he could careen his ship for extensive repairs. Instead, he encountered a violent storm that further damaged the Adventure and an outbreak of cholera that killed 40 of his men within a week. Other crewmen decided to leave Kidd's command, and to top it all off, the captain learned from passing ships that rumours were spreading that the Adventure had raised the black and turned to piracy. It was hard to think how things could get any worse for Captain Kidd, but then he also started to deal with the looming threat of mutiny. His men were getting fed up with enduring storms, outbreaks, and months at sea with nothing shiny to show for it. They'd better find something to plunder soon, or else. Captain Kidd and the Adventure Galley spent 1697 in and around the Indian Ocean. With many of his best men either press-ganged or felled by cholera, Kidd had no choice but to replenish his ranks with sailors of dubious reputations. Every now and then the Adventure did take a prize, but nothing big enough to keep the men happy. With each passing day, Kidd's crew was getting more and more discontent, and the idea of mutiny became more likely. On one occasion, after refusing to attack a Dutch merchant because it wasn't a valid target, the captain got into a loud shouting match with the ship's gunner, William Moore. In the heat of the moment, Kidd threw a bucket at Moore's head, fracturing his skull and killing him a day later. But this outburst of violence did little to quell the tensions bubbling beneath the surface. With over 2/3 of his crew wanting to turn pirate, Kidd understood that he couldn't swim against the current forever. He risked mutiny, or even worse. So ultimately, Kidd relented and thought maybe it would be just this one time. To his credit, Kidd picked a hell of a target, a giant Indian trading vessel called the Quaidar Merchant. In late 1697, the ship filled its cargo hold with cotton and left Surat in northwest India, rounding the southern tip before arriving in Bengal. There, it sold its goods and started on the journey home, with its coffers full of gold and silver, as well as valuable goods such as silk and muslin. It was certainly an inviting prize that would tempt any self-respecting pirate. On January the 30th, 1698, the Adventure captured the Quaidar Merchant off the southern coast of India. No fighting was necessary. The merchant vessel was travelling with a pass issued by the French East India Company. Kidd was aware of this and raised the French flag and boarded the ship without violence. The Quaidar Merchant was an Indian ship hired by Armenian merchants and captured by an Englishman. Despite this, Kidd hoped that he could argue back home that the fact that it was under the French authority made it a valid target. After all, governments back then had a tendency to play dumb whenever a privateer got a little too overzealous, but little did Kidd know that the wind was now blowing in a different direction. For starters, the war was over. England and France were at peace once more and eager to show that they were serious about stamping out piracy. But even more importantly, the Quaidar Merchant had ties to the Emperor of the Mughal Empire himself, Aurangzeb. Just 3 years earlier, Henry Every plundered one of the Grand Mughal ships, causing serious damage to the relationship between England and India. The last thing the British Crown needed was a repeat of that disaster, so as soon as word got back home of what Captain Kidd had done, all hell broke loose and several men of war were dispatched to hunt the pirate hunter. After the prize, Kidd travelled to Madagascar again, to the island of St. Mary. The Adventure had seen better days and was in desperate need of repairs again. Once there, Kidd found another ship named the Mocha frigate already docked in the harbour. He asked around who owned it, and the answer was like a twist straight out of a Shyamalan movie. The captain was a pirate by the name of Robert Culliford. By pure happenstance, Kidd had run into his old crew who mutinied against him and stole his first ship. This time Captain Kidd had the advantage. He had a crew of 115 and 3 ships at his disposal, not only the Adventure, but also another vessel called November and the Quaidar Merchant, which Kidd had kept and renamed the Adventure Prize. Now was the time for some revenge, right? Well, unfortunately, no. When Kidd informs the crew that he intended to attack Culliford, add the Mocha frigate to the fleet, and sail all 4 ships to London, where he would divvy up the loot, his men insisted on a vote, and they voted against him 100 to 15. It seems that one big prize had not been enough to wipe clean the 2 years of frustration that preceded it, and the crew would rather stay pirates and join Culliford, who triumphed over Kidd again, this time without even doing anything. Kidd had lost his command to mutiny once more, although this time he was at least able to convince his former crew to let him and his loyal men keep the Adventure Prize and their shares of the loot. Captain Kidd made it to the West Indies in April 1699. He wanted to sail to London or New York, but had become acutely aware of the political brouhaha that he caused when he captured the Quaidar Merchants. In fact, the year prior, King William III decreed an act of grace offering pardons to all pirates who willingly surrendered. There were just 2 exceptions to the proclamation. One was Henry Every, and the other was William Kidd. The captain left his ship in the West Indies and secured passage to New York. He hoped that he could still argue he acted lawfully as a privateer, but it was clear that the crown was out for blood. Kidd was arrested and sent to London, where he stood trial on 5 counts of piracy and 1 for the murder of William Moore. During his trial, Kidd refused to name his backers, the men who paid for the Adventure Galley and helped him secure his privateering commission. He naively hoped that his loyalty would be rewarded, but they did the exact opposite, completely distancing themselves and using him as a scapegoat. Unsurprisingly, William Kidd was found guilty on all charges and was executed on May 23, 1701. The fate of his ship became a mystery until 2007, when the wreckage was discovered near the Dominican Republic. Tales of buried treasure helped grow Captain Kidd's legacy to the point where he became one of the most notorious pirates in history, although the legitimacy of such a title remains a bone of contention to this day.